So we've been talking about weariness and how to navigate through it. And the key verse we've been talking about is John 10:10, where we see that it's the thief who comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but Jesus has come that we may have life and have it in abundance. Now, that's not just some abstract concept. One way he does that, brings us life, is that he puts specific things in each of us that give us great joy when we do them. Often that's part of a calling or a purpose because they manifest some small glimpse of his goodness to the world around us. When we do those things, especially when we do those things with God, it makes us come fully alive. It displays the glory of God. And this is the quote from St. Irenaeus that if I'm saying his name right, that I referenced in the last video, where he says, "The glory of God is man fully alive." Now, when you're in that mode, there's simply no place for weariness anymore. You crowd it out. It's got no place to land on you. Now, maybe you've already figured out what those things are that make you come alive, or that make you come alive when you do them. And you just need to be more intentional about doing some of those things in this season. Maybe you aren't really sure what those things are, and you need to spend some time with God and trying to figure that out. Well, to help you out in this, I wanted to share my own story. Now, I'll just warn you in advance, it's a long story, but there are some key God moments in here that are directly relevant to this topic, so I'm going to take the time to share it. Because I had one of those things that made me come alive, but the dream of doing it was so dead that I forgot that I ever had the dream in the first place. Until many years later, when God resurrected that long dead dream. And he did it so that I'd have the vehicle in place to find life, because he was setting me up to navigate through some incredible challenges and some potential weariness in my future that I didn't even know was coming. So in my case, for that time and that season, that thing that made me come alive was music, specifically singing. Now, I was always singing when I grew up, whether it was riding my bike as a kid or driving in my car as I got older or working my summer job on the landscaping crew of the golf course, I'd just be singing the whole time. I guess I did sing in the youth group, the church choir in high school, but really there was nothing formal or structured about my singing. I didn't have any training really. It was just more something I did inherently. Like I'd have this music running around in my head and I'd be singing, often driving my friends nuts in the process. Of course, as I got older, I went to see a lot of concerts, a lot of national bands, and to immerse myself in music. And I wanted to be in a band like those guys were. I dreamed of being up on stage singing, and not because of the crowd or because I really felt a compulsion to be a rock star or the fame or any of that kind of stuff, really just as a means to be singing, because I could feel the music and I just wanted to be part of creating it. Now, over the years, I'd done a few open mic nights, maybe a couple half-hearted attempts at an acoustic band. I even tried out for a band that I found in the classifieds in my early post-college years, and I was actually invited to join that band. But even in my unsaved, pre-Jesus condition, I knew that singing with that band was going to take me down a bad path with the partying, the late nights, and I was already having enough trouble, without that. So I declined. Now, I don't know exactly where the dream died, but sometime in that season, in the first few years out of college, after I'd moved out of my native Ohio and settled into the greater Baltimore area, I remember going to the clubs, watching some of the bands on the local scene, and some of them managed to build a pretty big regional following, even a national following, sign some modest record contracts, get their songs placed in some movies. I mean, these were bands that had kind of made it, and I'd be sitting there in the club watching those bands, singing my guts out from my seat there, and I vaguely remember thinking that it was just impossible. That here I was in my mid-20s with no experience. I could sing in my seat all I wanted, but the distance between me and that stage, of being part of a band, much less an actual good band, was a million miles away. Like that stage might as well have been on the moon. I was never going to walk on it. And somewhere in there, that dream just totally died. And then I got married, which was a total headstrong mistake the first time around. And I survived 3 years of that. My friends had no idea how I made it 3 weeks. And while God used all that to bring me to faith, that ordeal ended with divorce, in part due to her infidelity, but really it was just a foolish move on my part. And through all that, the dream of singing wasn't only dead, it was so deeply buried, I forgot I ever had it. Now, as I was putting the pieces of my life back together, or rather, God was, and He was doing a deep work in me through that period. I mean, I didn't even know who I was, but God was starting to shovel off some of the garbage I'd piled on myself and into my life. He was starting to work on my identity and slowly shoveling that garbage off and uncovering who He made me to be. And somewhere in that period, my friend Dave, a guy I worked with, he was a guitarist, and he introduced me to some cool Christian music. He invited me to this Christmas concert his church put on annually. Some of the musicians were, in a band he used to play with, and there were more talented musicians beyond that. And I knew they were a really strong group of musicians. And this Christmas concert turned out to be a big deal. They'd sell it out every year. This great sound and production, and multiple nights they'd sell out in this big auditorium. And so I went, and it was good and it was enjoyable, but it was about probably 2/3 of the way through that concert. This woman, Iris, the commanding African-American female vocalist, she launched into this song. I can't even remember what the song was, but I specifically remember thinking, wow, Whitney Houston has nothing on Iris. And by the time that song was over, I was crying, weeping really, for reasons I wasn't quite sure. But it had just awakened something in me, this deep ache, this unfulfilled longing. And without thinking, I kind of muttered out loud, "Oh Lord, I wish I could sing with someone like Iris." But it was painful to even hear myself say it, because I knew it was never going to happen. And trying to unwind from the pain of a divorce, I didn't need any more pain or any more broken dreams, so it just kind of sat on a shelf. But not too long later, maybe 6 months or so, my own church asked me to help out with the youth group, to be one of the adult leaders. And we met at the one guy's house, and I'm not sure quite it all happened. The other leaders were about 10 years older than me, but the one guy had a drum set down in the basement, and another guy had a guitar, a third one played a little bass, and I don't know, someone just suggested we mess around, jam on a few songs, and after a couple of the meetings, we did that. Went down in the basement. Now we ended up making more noise than music, but it was just kind of fun singing with them. And we did that a few times, but one of those times, the guy playing guitar, Jim, he came in and he said, "Hey guys, I wrote this song." And it was this 10-minute acoustic rock anthem all about Jesus from the period of his triumphal entry into Jerusalem to the crucifixion and resurrection. Now, not too much later, we had planned this lock-in for the youth group, for the kids, and where we'd lock them into the church all night and kind of have a sleep over there with a bunch of adults, and just good fun, but we needed some activities to keep the kids engaged. And someone said, "Hey, let's do a little talent show." And some of the kids had some musical talent, and us old guys, I was probably only 35 at the time, but to the youth group, of course, we were pretty old. And we decided, well, we'll play a few songs too, and we'll end with Jim's rock anthem, the 10-minute song. And that was fun. Us old guys, we had one rehearsal or two, I don't know, and we stumbled through the set. It was no big deal. That was that. Until a month or two later, we took the youth group to this weekend retreat. Somebody had invited us. It wasn't our retreat. It was at this camp in the mountains, and I think a couple mega churches must have put it on, because there were like 300-400, maybe 500 kids there from these big churches, and they had the resources. They brought in a couple professional touring bands for the worship sets. And then they ended up doing a concert Saturday night with their own material. But before the concert, they held this talent contest for all the youth. Now, we didn't have the full set of old guys who'd stumbled through the set at our lock-in, but we had a few of us, and we had our song and had a number of musically talented kids in the group. And so we entered our group into the contest, and then we spent just a few hours that afternoon, working up some parts, working up that song, worked out some vocal arrangement, taught some kids some various instrumental parts, made up a few more. We worked it up. Somehow, fortuitously, we drew the last slot. I think we were the 10th act. Now, a couple of the acts before us were pretty good, but a few of them took stuff that was in this totally inappropriate direction. And I remember the one immediately before us was especially raunchy, just not appropriate for a youth retreat and a church-sponsored youth retreat. And as we moved on to the stage, I remember there was this girl, Brooke, from our youth group, and I can see her right in the middle of the audience, and she's yelling out, "Put the focus back on Jesus, Mr. Scott." And I thought, well, we only got one song. It's a good thing it's a 10-minute rock anthem about Jesus. I guess, yeah, we'll sing about Jesus, not to worry, Brooke. And as we started to play, something shifted. And it was just one of those Holy Spirit moments where he just took over. And it's not like we were any good. I mean, there were only two of us that really kind of knew the song in the sense that we'd played it a few times. And the others had only practiced it all the way through, maybe once is about all the time we had. We weren't allowed to use the band's instruments. Our drummer was playing on a plastic trash can, and that broke partway through the song. But we were just singing and playing and worshiping our guts out, and the Holy Spirit showed up. And we might as well have been U2 singing 40 at the end of the show, if you've ever had that experience. It was one of those kind of moments. And at the end, the professional bands, the actual rock stars came up to us, and their eyes were this big around, and they said, "Dude, like that totally did not suck, and you have to keep doing it." And so we did. We had a combination of youth, and leaders from the youth group at first, all from our church at the start. We played the church picnic, but we kept writing some songs, and there were no egos. It was just a group collaboration. We had some talented people, but we were bootstrapping the whole thing from nothing, really. We had to figure out gear, sound systems. None of us had really played out much, but we started playing further afield. We eventually started doing some street festivals and some carnivals, and the lineup slowly evolved. We brought in some members who were from other churches, kind of broadened our musical horizons. And in those early days, we scraped together enough money to record our first CD, back when that was a really big deal. And we had to learn all that from scratch too, the entire production and engineering process of it. I mean, we could barely afford a few hours of studio time, much less a real engineer or producer, but that just came out. We were so proud of it. And then only 2 weeks later, after it was done, we were already playing so much better than that live than the CD we just captured in the studio that we could hardly stand to even listen to it. Now, our signature at the time was 4 vocalists. We had this intricate, compelling vocal arrangements, and all of us could sing pretty well. And that was the part that really captivated any audience, because most unseasoned bands, if you go see them, it's usually that they can't sing. They just can't sing. But we could, and we'd show up at a gig totally unknown, and the vocals would kind of hit the audience, just like that moment with Paul Potts on Britain's Got Talent that I referred to in the last video. And you're like, wow, where did these guys come from? But just as things were coming together and we were starting to feel like a real band, the one female vocalist, this young woman, moved away, and there went our vocal arrangements. And I wasn't sure what we were going to do, because all the songs were totally dependent on 4 vocal parts, and it just didn't work with 3. But again, my friend Dave kind of showed up at that moment to invite me to a jam session he was having with his former bandmates, a reunion of some of those musicians from that church Christmas concert I'd seen all those years ago. And crazy enough, Iris, the vocalist who God had used to reawaken my own dream of singing, was there. And I didn't really sing much because I didn't really know their material, but I did get to sing some ad hoc background vocals with Iris, and that was pretty cool. But that inspired me. A week or so later, I was just audacious enough to ask Iris if she'd like to join our band as the 4th vocalist, which was even harder because, it was a big ask because she lived an hour away. But to my great surprise, she said yes. And over the course of a few years, things had gone from this dream of singing being so dead, I forgot I even had it, to this painful lament of a reawakened dream that was an impossibility. I wish I could sing with someone like Iris. And now Iris was in my band. And I was singing with her and two other incredible vocalists all the time. Now, that lasted about a year before Iris had to move on as well. But as she was doing so, in this incredible full circle moment, Iris shared with me that in her whole singing career, she had never been so challenged and so stretched in a really good way in working with a group of vocalists as she had been with us. Now, if that was the end of it, that would be amazing enough, that full circle that God had brought this on. But there's so much more to the story, so many miracles, so many adventures, so many God moments. It was almost like God was forcing me through it to step up as a singer. Because while I started off as one of four vocalists, really a team approach, and we'd rotate the leads if there even was a lead, over time that was down to three, and then to two, and then it was largely just me, as the female vocalist was only able to join us on some of the gigs. Now, we'd end up running over 10 years with 4 to 5 major instantiations of that band with 2 different names and 4 to 5 dozen original songs and some covers, probably 30 different members over that course, 2.5 CDs and a lot more material, playing all kinds of venues and events that an all-original modern Christian rock band wasn't supposed to be playing. And it's way too long to tell all that story here. But there is one more part of the story that I want to share because it's relevant to our series on weariness. Now, near the end, our longtime drummer, now he was truly a core member. He wasn't our only songwriter, but he was the principal one, and he needed to move on. And I think the rest of us were starting to realize the band was kind of running its course, although we didn't want to admit it. But our bass player was pretty well connected in music circles, and he had a friend that was a drummer that had been deeply embedded in that Baltimore music scene that I talked about earlier. That drummer had spent a lifetime in all those bands, and we brought him in along with another player or two from that circle, and we were thinking, wow, we're entering this great new phase with even more seasons, some semi-pro musicians joining us, but it really ended up kind of being the final push. But after assimilating those new members, we decided to go into the studio, and our new drummer leveraged his connections. He engaged a few other guys from that Baltimore music scene to help us with our CD. In other words, those guys that in the beginning of this long story, I was sitting in the clubs, watching up on stage, wishing I could be in a band like theirs. And one of those guys was now running the recording studio we were in. And then another of those guys was doing all the mix down and production on it for us later. Now, one day, it was my turn to lay down some vocal tracks. We'd gotten the music track stabilized for the song, and I did like 3 takes in a row on the song. And I felt like I'd captured the essence of the song. I thought, well, that probably turned out pretty good. Like one of those takes ought to work, or, maybe we could take pieces of a couple, but, we probably got the material. But then that's when the engineer pulled us all back into the sound booth, the whole band. And he made us all listen to my vocal track. And I thought, well, he's going to point out where I need to sync better with what one of the guitarists is doing or something like that. And instead, about halfway through that playback, he stopped and asked if everyone knew what they were listening to. I'm like, I don't know, it's Scott singing. And he said, yeah. But that's all 3 takes of Scott singing, stacked on top of each other. He's playing them all back at once. And it more or less sounds like one take, he says. And he went on to say, when we did our first album, and I know that he's talking about the nationwide release on the major record label they did 40 years ago, that they were still earning royalty from because it kept appearing and reappearing in movie soundtracks. And he said, when we did that album, our vocalist had to do like a dozen takes just on that one song. And the producers had to piece them all together to get a single vocal that was usable for the album. And he said, Scott just gave us 3 perfect takes in a row, and we could use any single one of them as is. And he finished by saying, our guy, and I know he's talking about the guy that's still playing professionally after all these years. He said, our guy has nothing on Scott. Now that's amazing. And again, God gave me this full circle moment where the dream was literally dying as I was watching those guys make music. I was just some random face in the crowd. It was impossible for me to be on that stage. They certainly wouldn't pay any attention to me or to my singing. And here, all these years later, a few of those same guys are listening to me sing, and they're all blown away by it. Now, please hear what I'm saying in this, because it's not about music at all. I don't even know the lead vocalist to whom I was being compared in that full circle moment. I never met him, but I love his vocals. He's an excellent musician. I would never compare myself to him. That's not this point. Like millions of people, including you, have heard his songs, and it's almost certain that you've never heard mine. That's not the point behind these crazy circumstances that only God could have architected. Now, it's amazing how far our little band went, where we ended up, given how little we started with, that we had to bootstrap and self-fund the whole way. We literally had to absolutely learn everything from scratch. In the beginning, most of us had never even played out before. And while the thing never quite ended up where we wanted it, and indeed, the band in its final iteration ended about one gig after that full circle recording studio moment I just described. It was only years later, something that I realized in the process of writing my book, because the book's a similar creative process, and I was sharing with the Lord some of the disappointments of the music process that I wanted to avoid in the book process, and it just hit me. Here, I had thought the music, the singing, was something I was doing for him. And it was in some ways. And he honored that by doing some really cool things with it. And he impacted people through it. And we saw people get saved through it. You know, we had some great conversation through it. Some people learned about Jesus through it. But really, I kind of missed the point. That it wasn't that he bootstrapped this band so much because what I was doing through it for him. It was much more so that the band, the vehicle that served as the resurrection of my long dead dream to sing, it was much more so that that was something he was doing for me. Now, I'm sure he used it for many purposes in the other band members' lives also, but for my part in the band, it was his gift to me. See, what I didn't know, even as the band was turning or transforming from a few old guys making music in the basement to a fully functional band, I didn't know that I'd soon be starting up Yakabod. And now startups, especially self-funded bootstrap startups, are really stressful. And it's only recently that I drew that connection, that the timing of God resurrecting this long dead dream was to create the space for me to do something that brought me life, so that it would help carry me through the forthcoming challenges of building a startup. Now, my wife will tell you, my current wife, my final wife, will tell you that she saw it time and time again. Like, I'd be beat up, worn down, exhausted from the startup. Like, I didn't even feel like singing, but I'd go down into that basement for practice, and I would come back upstairs a totally different man. Like, I'm always living in the future, but singing in the band was one of those few things I could do where I was just totally immersed in the moment. And in this case, I was immersed in it with God. Of course, it was to worship him, but it was also a blessing to me, like just this joyful time of freedom. I get exactly what that runner in the Chariots of Fire meant, where he said he could feel the joy of the Lord when he ran, because I could literally feel the joy of the Lord when I was singing with the band, even if it was just in the basement. Now, back to tie this all into the subject of weariness, that's what I'm encouraging you to find and to do. The things that bring you life like that. Now, not in a narcissistic or self-absorbed way, but to partner with God to understand those things he's already put inside of you. And now more than ever, spend some time doing those things with him. You probably already know what those things are. Your dream is probably not nearly as dead as mine was. But if God can do it for me to create the space to do that thing, even when the dream was dead, he can and certainly will do it for you. He's such a good father that way. But there's one more reason I shared both those full circle moments with you. That even though the band's been in hibernation for probably a dozen years now, I also only just realized recently that God was also working on something else in me in that period, something that's going to be relevant to our next step as we talk about weariness. And that's, how do we lead our teams through the weariness of the day? And that starts with our own identity, specifically our identity in who God made us to be as leaders, and our confidence in that identity. Now, many of you, you're just like I was, sitting in the seats, watching the professionals sing. Like, I knew I could sing okay, but put me around them, well, I'm just posing. I mean, I might sing, but I'm not really a singer in that context. You know what I mean? And a whole bunch of us feel the same way about leadership. In fact, most CEOs that I personally know are secretly afraid that someone's going to find them out. I feel that myself much of the time, that someone's going to find out that really we have no idea what we're doing, not qualified at all to lead. Like, it's that guy with 1 million followers on LinkedIn, or the guy that wrote that book, or the CEO of that big company that's so famous. Like, those are the real leaders, and I won't ever be one of them. That's how we feel, isn't it? But that's just not true. If God has called you to lead, He's already put it inside of you. He's continuing to train and equip you to lead in that area of influence He's given you to lead. And He is perfectly able to show Himself strong through your weakness. No matter where you are in that journey, you can move ahead with confidence. Like, you'll remember the entire army of Israel, all seasoned warriors, including their king, were scared silly in the face of Goliath. But not the little shepherd boy David. He knew who God made him to be. In partnership with God, he'd already killed the lion and the bear. This heathen Philistine would be no different. And that's what God did for me in my singing with these full circle moments. I wasn't a legit singer because of the stage I was on, or how many CDs I sold, or even what kind of technical talent I had, which admittedly isn't a lot. I'm a legit singer because that's part of who God made me to be. That's part of who He says I am. And He architected some crazy full circle circumstances to provide His little smile of affirmation on that. Those moments with Iris and with the big name band guys from Baltimore, those were my lion and the bear. The circumstances that gave me that shot of confidence that it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. I am who God says I am. And that, my friends, is one foundational element of helping lead our teams through weariness, not just navigating our own way through weariness. But this video has been long enough already. We'll dig into that into the next one. Thanks for following along. Be blessed, and I'll see you soon.